The house stood still, wrapped in silence so thick it almost echoed. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, the sort that cradled you after a long day. No, this was different. This silence pressed down on everything. On the walls, the floors, the air. It filled the space like smoke, lingering long after the fire had passed. I in the corner of the living room. Near the bay window, Lily curled herself into a tight little ball. Her knees were tucked under her chin, arms wrapped around her legs, face hidden behind a curtain of light brown curls. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She barely blinked. Outside, a car drove by, slow, then fast again. The moment the engine's hum reached her ears, Lily flinched. Her small body trembled as she pressed herself deeper into the corner, as though she could melt into the walls and disappear. Olivia, her mother, watched from the kitchen doorway. Her hands trembled around the coffee mug she hadn't touched in over an hour. The coffee had gone cold, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the tiny figure in the corner, the daughter she could no longer reach. Ethan entered the room, holding a soft pink blanket. He knelt beside Lily, trying not to startle her. With the gentlest hands, he draped the blanket over her shoulders. She didn't look up. She didn't cry. She simply continued to exist, locked in a world of her own making. "She hasn't eaten anything today," Olivia whispered. Ethan nodded but said nothing. What could he say? It had been 3 weeks since they found Lily on the side of the highway, abandoned and terrified, barefoot and silent. 3 weeks since the police had called in the middle of the night to tell them their little girl had been found alive. Alive, but not the same. Doctors had called it selective mutism, a condition rooted in trauma. Lily could speak. There was nothing physically wrong, but she wouldn't. Not even a single word. They had taken her to therapy. Tried everything. Books, dolls, drawings. Olivia had sung lullabies until her voice cracked. Ethan had read her favorite bedtime story, The Bear Who Loved the Moon, every night, though Lily never turned a page. She just sat there, eyes vacant, hands gripping the corners of her chair. The home, once filled with laughter and dancing feet, was now a graveyard of sound. That evening, the sun dipped behind the trees. Shadows stretched long across the living room floor. Olivia sat beside her daughter, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She didn't try to speak. Words had become too heavy, too useless. She just sat there, hoping, praying for a miracle. The courthouse was an old building, gray stone, tall columns, a clock tower that hadn't kept time in years. It stood in the center of town like a relic from another age, where justice wore a powdered wig and words carried the weight of fate. But today, it held something far heavier than tradition, the shattered pieces of a little girl's life. Inside Courtroom 3, the air was taut with tension. The gallery was half-filled, local reporters, a few curious townsfolk, and rows of solemn-faced officers who had been involved in the case. But in the front row, seated with pale knuckles and eyes red from sleepless nights, were Ethan and Olivia. Lily sat between them. Her legs dangled from the wooden bench, feet not quite touching the floor. She held a worn stuffed bear in her lap, the only object she'd clung to since her return. Her eyes didn't roam. They stared straight ahead, unblinking. Across the room, seated behind the defense table, were 2 men. Jackson and Carter, dressed in suits that didn't quite fit, their expressions unreadable. Jackson tapped his fingers on the desk, eyes darting from the jury box to the judge's bench. Carter leaned back slightly, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. They didn't look like monsters. That's what chilled Olivia the most. No horns, no snarls. Just 2 ordinary men who had done something unspeakable. Judge Logan entered the courtroom with a calm presence that silenced the murmurs. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s, known for his fairness and unshakable demeanor. Today, even he seemed more measured, his eyes softer as they settled on Lily. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Logan presiding. The proceedings began. Opening statements from the prosecution. A quiet, methodical listing of what was known. That Lily had been taken from a local park. That witnesses had seen a black SUV speeding away. That Lily had been found 72 hours later, alone on the roadside. The defense claimed it was all circumstantial. No physical evidence, no fingerprints, no eyewitness who could definitively place Jackson or Carter at the scene. Then came the witnesses. The officer who found Lily. The detective who led the investigation. The park employee who'd noticed the strange vehicle. But without Lily's voice, the case felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. As the trial wore on, Olivia gripped Ethan's hand tightly. She watched Lily, who sat like a statue, expressionless, as if the courtroom were just another shadow in her world. Each time one of the suspects was mentioned, Lily's eyes flicked toward them, but only for a moment. Then they returned to the bear in her lap. When it was time for Lily to take the stand, Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat. "Is she ready?" Judge Logan asked gently. Ethan nodded slowly. "She wants to try." Lily was led to the witness chair by a court-appointed child psychologist. She climbed up onto the seat, Bear still in her arms. The courtroom went completely still. Judge Logan leaned forward slightly. "Lily," he said, his voice a kind whisper, "I know this is hard. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. But if you recognize anyone here, anyone who hurt you, you can show us. Just point, sweetheart. That's all you have to do." Lily didn't move for a long time. The silence stretched unbearably. The tension was a taut wire about to snap. Then, very slowly, her small hand lifted. She pointed directly at Jackson, and then, with the same calm certainty, she pointed at Carter. The murmur swept through the room. The defense attorneys rose in protest, but Judge Logan raised a hand. "That will be noted on the record," he said quietly. Still, the burden of proof was heavy. The prosecutor had hoped Lily might speak, might confirm what she remembered, but the words didn't come. Only silence, and that solemn, unwavering point. After the recess, Olivia knelt beside Lily in the hallway and kissed her forehead. "You were so brave, baby," she whispered. So brave." But in the courtroom, Jackson and Carter sat with a renewed sense of confidence. Without direct testimony, without hard evidence, they thought they might walk free. They didn't know the storm that was coming. And it had 4 legs, a scar above its eye, and a nose that never forgot. Long before the cold walls of the courtroom, long before she pointed her finger in silence, Lily had been just a little girl in a summer dress, chasing butterflies at the edge of a park trail. Her laughter had rung out like wind chimes, soft and happy, as she held a juice box in one hand and a crayon-scribbled map in the other. On a make-believe treasure hunt her dad had helped her draw. It had all happened in the blink of an eye. Ethan had looked away for only a moment. He remembered tying his shoe. Olivia had been helping a younger mother find her car keys near the playground. And then Lily was gone. The next 72 hours stretched into a lifetime. Police officers combed the woods, helicopters buzzed overhead, and the neighborhood was blanketed in missing child posters bearing Lily's wide, innocent eyes. Olivia refused to sleep, camped by the phone with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Ethan didn't eat, didn't cry. He just searched. And on the 3rd night, just before dawn, an officer's voice crackled through the radio. "We've got her. Highway 12. She's alive." They found her near a row of trees by the road, barefoot and alone. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. She had no bruises, no visible marks. But her silence was louder than any scream could have been. She didn't cry out when the officers lifted her. She didn't respond when Ethan fell to his knees and pulled her into his arms, sobbing against her hair. She didn't flinch. She simply looked past him. Since that day, Lily had not spoken a single word. She didn't respond to music or favorite cartoons or the scent of her mother's pancakes. No smiles, no tears, Just a blank stare and the distant look of a child who had gone far away inside herself. Doctors called it selective mutism. It wasn't uncommon in children who had suffered extreme trauma. In simple terms, Lily's voice was still there. She just couldn't find the safety to use it. Therapists tried everything. Olivia sat through session after session, holding back her own tears as they asked Lily to draw, to speak, to play with dolls and toys. The most they ever got were scribbles in blue and gray. Dark skies, a house with no windows, a tiny girl standing beside a large, black shape that no one could quite make out. Ethan did what he could. He brought her flowers from the backyard, read to her at night, even when her eyes stayed locked on the ceiling. On her 5th birthday, he filled the house with pink balloons and placed a cupcake with a candle in front of her. Lily didn't move. She simply stared at the flickering flame, then slowly turned away. It was killing them. Watching her vanish day by day. One evening, Olivia sat alone in the nursery. She stared at the empty crib they hadn't yet taken apart and whispered, "I just want her back, God. I don't care if she never says another word. I just want her to be okay." The next day at therapy, after another long and silent session, the therapist knelt beside Olivia and Ethan with a gentle suggestion. "There's something different we can try," she said. "It's not conventional, but in cases like this, when trauma runs deep, it sometimes helps." Olivia wiped her eyes. "We'll do anything." The therapist smiled softly. "Have you ever heard of a therapy dog? Or, more specifically, a retired canine?" They met him on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The therapy center was unusually quiet that day. Olivia held Lily close under a shared umbrella as they walked across the parking lot. Lily's head rested against her mother's shoulder, her stuffed bear held tight in one arm, as always. Ethan followed beside them, unsure what to expect but willing, desperate, for anything that might help. Inside, the therapist greeted them with a soft smile and led them down a hallway to a small, private room. There were no fluorescent lights or stiff chairs in here, just soft rugs, plush cushions, and sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains. A few toys were scattered in a corner, untouched, and then they saw him. Lying near the far wall, his large head resting on crossed paws, was a German shepherd with a thick, sable coat and intelligent, amber eyes. A faint scar ran above one eye, barely noticeable, but it gave him a certain quiet dignity. He didn't move when they entered, didn't rush toward them. He simply lifted his head and looked at Lily. "This is Thor," the therapist said gently, crouching beside the dog. "He's a retired canine. Worked in the force for 6 years. He was injured in the line of duty during a kidnapping case 3 months ago. Since then, he's been resting and retraining for a different kind of work now." Lily peeked out from behind Olivia's shoulder. Her eyes met Thor's and held. Thor didn't break the gaze. He didn't bark or whine or inch closer. He simply stayed where he was, offering only presence. Quiet, steady, calm. "May she?" Olivia asked. The therapist nodded. They placed Lily gently onto a nearby floor cushion. She sat motionless, her bear still clutched in her hands. A full minute passed in silence. Thor didn't move. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he stood up and walked halfway across the room. Then lay down again, a few feet from her. The distance was respectful, non-threatening. Lily didn't retreat. Every few seconds, she glanced at him. Her fingers fidgeted with the fur on her stuffed bear. Her eyes blinked slowly, absorbing the moment. Ethan watched, barely breathing. It was the first time in weeks he'd seen her even acknowledge something unfamiliar. "Thor is trained to respond to fear," the therapist whispered. "He doesn't overwhelm. He waits. He lets the child come to him, on their terms." The session lasted 30 minutes. Lily never spoke, never moved from the cushion. But when it was time to leave and Olivia extended her arms to lift her daughter, Lily reached back, ever so briefly, and touched Thor's PAW. It wasn't much, but it was something. The following week, Lily returned. Thor was waiting, And that time, she walked into the room on her own. She didn't speak, but she sat closer, only a foot away this time. Thor gave her a slow blink and lay down beside her. She sat quietly, her hand resting on the floor just near his tail. Day after day, the visits continued. Sometimes Lily would bring a crayon with her, sometimes a sticker. Once, she brought a tiny rubber duck and placed it near his paw. Thor didn't react, but he didn't move it either. He simply let it sit there. One afternoon, Olivia watched from the doorway with a hand over her mouth. Lily was drawing on a sketch pad, knees tucked under her, and Thor lay beside her, his head resting gently against her leg. Lily's small hand slowly moved toward him, and she began tracing the edge of his ear with her fingers. The therapist looked at Olivia and whispered, "She's starting to trust again." The leaves outside had begun to turn golden. Autumn crept gently across the trees, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel quite so cold. There was no longer just a guest in their lives. He had become something far more, something sacred. He slept by Lily's bed each night, his breathing slow and steady, a rhythm that soothed the fear still tucked in the corners of her heart. During the day, he followed her quietly around the house, not too close, but always near. In the beginning, Lily would only look at him. Then, she started brushing his fur with short, gentle strokes. Then came the smiles, rare and fleeting, like sunbeams breaking through storm clouds. But the words still hadn't come. Olivia and Ethan tried not to hope too hard. Progress was progress, they told themselves. A smile was more than they'd had a month ago. But deep down, they longed for something more. For that one sign their daughter was truly coming back. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of afternoon where the sky weeps steadily and the world feels wrapped in a blanket of gray. They were in the therapy room again. Thor stretched out beside Lily, who was drawing with a blue crayon. Her legs were folded beneath her, her eyes focused, lips pressed in quiet concentration. The therapist sat nearby, journaling silently, giving Lily space. Suddenly, Lily stopped coloring. She looked down at Thor. Her small hand moved to his neck, fingers running gently along his collar. And then, so softly that even the walls seemed to hush, "Good boy." The therapist froze. Thor's ears perked, but he didn't move. Across the room, Olivia had been sipping from a paper cup. It slipped from her hand, landing on the rug unnoticed as she clapped a hand to her mouth. Her eyes widened. Ethan sat forward, stunned silent. Lily looked up briefly, then returned to her drawing. She said nothing more, but the words had been real. Whispered. Alive, the first word since the abduction. The first crack in the silence. The therapist's voice trembled as she leaned forward and said gently, "That was beautiful, Lily. Thor is a very good boy, isn't he?" Lily didn't answer, but a faint smile touched her lips. That evening at home, Olivia tucked Lily into bed and reached to turn out the light. Thor was already curled up on the floor beside the bed, eyes watching protectively. Olivia paused at the door. "Good night, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're so proud of you." Lily blinked slowly, and then, barely audible, came a whisper, "Night-night, Mommy." Olivia gasped. Her hand flew to her chest. She turned back to Ethan, who had heard it too, his face frozen in a mixture of shock and wonder. She knelt beside the bed, brushing Lily's hair from her face, tears falling freely now. "I love you, Lily. So much." Lily reached for her mother's hand. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. In that moment, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of healing, of hope, of the first fragile thread of connection being rewoven. Thor lifted his head and let out a low, satisfied huff, as if to say, "It's beginning." The courtroom was solemn. Tall windows let in pale sunlight, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Rows of pew-like benches were filled with reporters, victims' advocates, and families clutching hands, whispering prayers. At the front, Judge Logan sat in his high-backed chair, face unreadable, but eyes sharp behind his glasses. Jackson and Carter, suits ill-fitting, eyes darting, sat at the defense table, their lawyers murmuring beside them. They looked confident, too confident. They believed they had outsmarted the system, that the lack of direct evidence would protect them. Lily and her parents sat in the front row, hearts pounding. She wore a soft yellow dress. Her hair was braided neatly down one side, and in her arms, never far, was Thor. Though he wasn't officially allowed in the courtroom, special permission had been granted after her therapist submitted a psychological report explaining Thor's critical role in Lily's recovery. He sat beside her, alert but calm. When Judge Logan called Lily's name to the stand, the room fell silent. Ethan stood and lifted his daughter gently. He carried her to the witness box and sat her down on the small cushioned seat, her feet swinging above the floor. Thor trotted beside them, taking his position just beneath the stand. Lily's hand remained on his head the entire time. Judge Logan leaned forward. His voice was low and careful. "Lily, I know this is hard. You don't have to say anything. But I'd like to ask, do you recognize the men who hurt you?" Lily looked up. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Then she slowly turned her head toward the defense table. Her small hand lifted and pointed, clear and steady, at Jackson and Carter. The courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor nodded, her eyes full of quiet triumph. But the defense attorney stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. With all due respect to the trauma this child has endured, pointing is not testimony. There is still no physical evidence tying my clients to the crime." Judge Logan sighed. "Objection noted. But the child's identification will be entered into the record." Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. That's when it happened. Thor, lying quietly beneath the witness stand, suddenly stood. His ears went up. His nose twitched, and without warning, he broke from Lily's side and padded swiftly across the courtroom. He went straight to Jackson, growling low in his throat. Thor sniffed the man's pants and shoes, then barked. Once, sharp and piercing. Then again, and again. Everyone froze. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure. "Control your dog." But Judge Logan held up a hand. Thor stood rooted before Jackson, teeth bared slightly, barking now with force. He then turned to Carter and barked again. Short, loud, focused. "Enough," Judge Logan said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "What is this about?" The room buzzed with tension. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Your Honor, Thor was injured in the line of duty during a kidnapping case 3 months ago. Perhaps he remembers something we don't." Judge Logan leaned back in his chair. "We're taking a recess. I want the officers who handled Thor's last case in my chambers. Now." The trial paused. The courtroom emptied. The world outside kept spinning, but for those involved, time had slowed. That same evening, the police reopened Thor's old case file. The one involving the remote cabin. The one where Thor had chased 2 masked suspects into the woods but had been injured before he could catch them. Detectives followed the trail again. With renewed urgency, they collected old soil samples from the suspect's abandoned car, matched tire tracks, and analyzed fibers found on the back seat. Then, following a lead Thor had given with his nose and his bark, they returned to that same cabin, deep in the forest, past the gravel roads where no cell signal reached. What they found changed everything. The cabin was still there, quiet, weather-beaten, and nestled deep within the forest like it had been waiting to be remembered. It took the search team nearly 2 hours to reach it. The roads were muddy from recent rains, and the trees hung heavy with silence. Sergeant Miller led the team, flashlight in hand, flanked by 2 officers and a canine unit, though not Thor. He was home now, by Lily's side, his role shifting from protector to guardian of peace. The cabin's front door creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, dust blanketed every surface. Cans of food sat on cracked shelves, expired but untouched. Cobwebs hung from corners. At first glance, the place seemed abandoned, lifeless. But then Officer Reynolds stepped near the fireplace and frowned. Something's off. The floorboards beneath her boots made a hollow sound. Not the solid thump of old wood, but the echo of something beneath. They pried up the planks, and there it was, a trapdoor, locked from above, camouflaged with grime and debris. It groaned as they forced it open. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air below stale and tinged with something sour. Flashlights on, Miller ordered. Guns ready. They moved slowly. The basement was cold. The walls were lined with shelves filled with canned goods, old blankets, and plastic jugs of water. But it wasn't the supplies that made Officer Reynolds gasp. It was the sound, a faint sob, a whisper of breath, a shuffle, and then, from behind a plywood barrier, they found them. Two girls, curled in a corner, limbs trembling, eyes wide. One older, maybe 10, the other barely 8. Pale, malnourished, but alive. They blinked against the flashlight glare, shielding their faces. The older one whispered hoarsely, "Are you the police?" Reynolds dropped to her knees. "Yes, sweetheart. You're safe now." Sophia and Amelia. Their faces had once been plastered across milk cartons, highway signs, news reports. Missing, presumed dead. And yet, here they were, saved by a dog's memory. Back at the precinct, chaos met relief. Reporters gathered. Families wept. The girls were wrapped in blankets, fed warm meals, and placed under medical care. And when they were ready, when their voices grew strong enough, they began to talk about the 2 men who had taken them, about the black SUV, about the cabin, about being told to stay quiet, stay hidden, while the men handled other business. They remembered Carter's tattoo, Jackson's limp, the way one of them always wore gloves, even inside. They remembered everything, and the evidence backed them up. Hair samples in the cabin matched both men. Tire tracks matched the vehicle found abandoned after Lily's kidnapping. A fingerprint on one of the food cans, Carter's. The missing puzzle pieces snapped into place with devastating clarity. In the courtroom, the atmosphere changed, and no longer did Jackson and Carter look smug. Their eyes darted. Their lawyers whispered furiously. The walls felt like they were closing in. The prosecutor stood and spoke with fire in her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have direct evidence. Witnesses, forensics, and survivors. These 2 men didn't just harm one child. They orchestrated a string of abductions, hiding behind shadows and silence. But that silence has been shattered." Judge Logan's gavel struck the desk. Trial will resume with new charges. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, child endangerment, attempted murder. Lily sat in the courtroom again, her hand on Thor's back, watching with quiet eyes. She didn't need to speak. The truth was roaring now. The final day of the trial dawned under a sky heavy with clouds. There was no media frenzy outside the courthouse anymore, just a quiet sense of gravity. Inside, every bench was filled. The room buzzed with whispers of anticipation, hope, and fear. Lily sat between her parents, her small hand clutching Thor's ear gently. She wasn't nervous, just watchful. Her eyes didn't blink much. She had seen too much already for one lifetime. Across the aisle, Jackson and Carter looked defeated. The trial had stretched nearly a week beyond its original schedule. Every day had brought another piece of damning evidence. Sophia and Amelia's tearful testimony, the photographs from the basement, the bruises, the journal entries, the matching tire tracks, the cabin, the prints, the soil. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Lily was called back to the stand, and no longer did her father carry her. She walked, small steps, but steady, her hand brushing against Thor's back as he paced beside her. She climbed into the witness seat and looked directly at the judge. Judge Logan gave her a soft smile. "Lily, do you feel ready to speak today?" "Only if you want to." Lily looked at Thor. He blinked at her slowly, tail thumping once against the floor. She looked back at the judge, and then, in the same clear, steady voice that had once whispered in therapy, she said, "They took me. A collective breath caught across the courtroom. Lily pointed again. That one hurt my arm, she said, nodding toward Jackson. And the other one locked the door. Even Judge Logan leaned back in his chair, visibly moved. Thank you, Lily, he said quietly. You are very brave. Ethan was crying. Olivia had both hands over her mouth, eyes shimmering. And Thor? Thor simply stayed still, eyes fixed forward, silent, strong. The jury returned 2 hours later. The forewoman stood on the charges of child abduction, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. We find the defendants guilty. The room remained quiet. It wasn't shock, just the weight of justice finally arriving. A burden being lifted. Judge Logan looked directly at Jackson and Carter. You preyed on the most vulnerable. You caused irreparable harm to innocent lives. This court sentences you both to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. There were no outbursts, no protests, only the sound of 2 chairs scraping as the convicts were led away in cuffs. Later, outside the courthouse, the family stood under a wide oak tree as the clouds parted and sunlight streamed through like a blessing. Lily leaned against Thor's side, giggling as his nose nudged her hand. Olivia crouched beside her, holding her face gently. You were amazing, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. Then, for the first time since it all began, Lily turned to her mother, her eyes bright, and said, Mommy. Not whispered, not forced, just real. Olivia crumpled into her arms, sobbing, not from grief, but from joy. Ethan joined them, folding all 3 into an embrace. And Thor? He circled them once, then lay at their feet, tail wagging slowly, like a sentry whose duty had been fulfilled. The house felt different. That it wasn't the furniture or the walls or the creaky stairs. It was the air, lighter, warmer, the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with peace. A week had passed since the trial ended. Lily no longer curled up in corners when a car drove by. She no longer flinched when the doorbell rang. The ghosts of that terrible day hadn't vanished, but they had grown quiet, outshined by something greater, hope. Ethan had taken time off work. Olivia spent every day with her daughter, not hovering with worry anymore, but walking, painting, planting flowers in the garden with tiny hands in hers. They spoke again, not often but enough. Each word from Lily was a treasure, a note in a healing symphony. And Thor was everywhere. He followed Lily like a silent shadow, out in the yard, in her room, even lying beside her while she brushed her teeth, tail sweeping the floor like a metronome. His injury from the line of duty still made him limp slightly, but it never slowed him down when Lily called. They were inseparable. One afternoon, Olivia stood in the kitchen, slicing strawberries, when she heard something. A burst of giggles from the backyard. She peeked out the window. Lily was on her knees in the grass, holding a stick in one hand and her other outstretched toward Thor, who sat with regal patience. Shake, Lily said clearly. Thor lifted his paw and placed it in her palm. Lily laughed, free and light, and Olivia dropped the knife, bringing her hands to her mouth. She didn't cry this time. She just watched, smiling, whole. That evening, the family sat around the dinner table, together, like they hadn't in so long. Ethan raised a glass of lemonade and said, "To the bravest girl we know." Lily smiled shyly. "And to the best dog in the world," she added softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough to echo across every broken moment they'd survived. Thor barked once, then laid his head on her lap. Years passed. Lily grew. Her voice became steady, her laugh frequent. The memories of that terrible day never vanished, but they became part of a greater story, one of strength, not fear. She started school again, made friends, spoke on her own terms at a school assembly 2 years later. She stood on stage to share her story with other children, many of them nervous, shy, or hurting in their own way. She held a framed photo of Thor in her hands and said, clearly and proudly, "This is Thor. He's my best friend. He saved me when I was lost. Not just my body, but my voice. Sometimes you don't need words to help someone. You just need to be there and wait. This is a story of courage, healing, and the unspoken bond between a child and a dog. Lily survived because love waited for her, patiently, faithfully, in the form of a retired canine with a heart big enough to carry her pain. Thor was not just a dog. He was a hero, a healer, a bridge between fear and hope, and because of him, a broken little girl found her way home.